Thank you, Dipali, and thanks to all the panelists for a really wonderful set of remarks. I'm going to take, I would urge our audience to use the chat function to send in questions. We have a few, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question to get us going. This session has been conducted under the penumbra, obviously, of the history of 1989 to 1992. And its applicability to perhaps the current situation in Afghanistan. The parallels are obvious: the withdrawal of foreign forces, the role of the neighbors. There are many more analogs that one could come up with. But of course, analogies are tricky and they tend to break down when one gets into specifics. But I wonder if I could ask the panelists if it is useful to be thinking of the current situation in Afghanistan in terms of what happened in 1989, 1992. And are there any specific lessons that could be drawn for policymakers right now from that period? So why don't I open it up and all of the panelists are welcome to address that, and then we'll go on to questions from the audience. Omar Sadr, did I see you looking like you wanted to perhaps take a shot at this one?
Okay, so let me jump in. Well, there are parallels that we can draw between the two: end of conflicts, end of Soviet invasion, and end of US intervention. First of all, just recently, one journalist in Kabul translated a diary of ISI general, which was written at the end of 80s, I think, and that narrates the history of Soviet invasion and how Pakistan backed insurgents, mujahideen, against the communist government. So the findings of that book somehow tells us that there are so many similarities. First of all, the way insurgents were backed, and they were proxies, there were sanctuaries across the border, they were financed, and ideologically they were trained. Same as with at this moment, Taliban are doing the same thing that Mujahideen were doing earlier. The other side, one of the key causes of the collapse of the Soviet-backed Kabul regime was, I think, at the end, it was ethnocentrism of it. The regime didn't fall apart because of the army was weak or probably financial support. Of course, financial support continued for 2 years, but one of the key factors behind the fall of Kabul was the ethnocentrism, where the Watan party was divided between the Tajiks and the others, who one backed Jamiat party and the other backed Hizb Islami. So now you can see the same thing now, the ethnocentrism around President Ghani, and the toxic environment which has been reproduced, regenerated, reinforced, unfortunately, through social media platforms. And in some cases you see statements of racism. So to me, I think even it's worse than 1990s, because back then there wasn't social media and platforms to reach out to the masses, but now there is. But at the same time, there are differences also. I think back in the 90s, the Kabul government was abandoned by the international support and the USSR. But now, despite the fact that US is pulling out, but there is continuous commitment that government will be financed. There will be humanitarian aid, developmental aid, and diplomatic support, political support, and that was quite clear from the US side, also European Union. So that's the difference. Second is, of course, I think what Dr. Robert Crew also mentioned, that we have, of course, the generation which is produced in the last 20 years, who are much well aware now of the certain values, the way identity is divided, and how to preserve these values. What I referred earlier in my intervention was, of course, not these things. I was talking about intellectualism and the way ideas are framed and produced, mobilizing and counter-mobilizing ideas. And on that part, of course, there are problems. But I mean, the level of public awareness is much more higher. The third one, I think the third similarity would be if in case there would be a continuation of crisis from September 12 onwards, we will have probably a mass exodus, a refugee crisis in the region, because the politicians, unfortunately, at the moment, doesn't have the capacity to lead and unify the factions and groups together. Their rhetoric and their political behavior is unfortunately dividing. It's not the fault of people, it's the fault of the elites and those who are in government, that they cannot unify all of us. Unfortunately, that will have an extremely negative impact when it comes to the societal cohesion and somehow unity of the people. I will stop here, I think.
Thank you very much, Omar. Do any of the other panelists want to take this one on, or yes, Omar Sharifi, please.
Thank you. When I was just about the similarities and differences in this specific case, when I was reading the letters between Dr. Kokar and Dr. Najib, as an Afghan, when I was reading it, there is an understanding that both sides, in a sense, and also from the Mujahideen sides, they all have some sort of like a kind of a memory of a pre-war Afghanistan. They sort of, there is an understanding among both sides at what Afghanistan was before, how it worked, what was the idea of the state, how the institutions were working, what kind of society we had. There was some sort of, what do you call it, like a historical conscience about it. And when we read in another context, like Dr. Najib's exchange of letters with some of the Mujahideen commanders of that period, we see that the same kind of historical conscience existed between these groups. Today, what we're facing is, when we read, and specifically for me, who I actually grew up under the Taliban and the first-hand experience their rule and their regime, what we're seeing here is sort of a disconnect between what President Ghani talks, what the Afghan government talks, what the Afghan civil society talks, what the international community says, and the Taliban leadership. Because I do not believe personally that the ISI training camps and the Haqqani madrasas in Peshawar actually raise people who actually have a historical consciousness of who are. Majority of the Taliban leadership, and I'm not talking about just their fighters and others who may have some local connections, but the leadership, including the Haqqanis, they grew up in that environment in which, especially even in the 1990s, when I was like asking the Taliban about how they imagine Afghanistan, there is a break. There's a very little to no sense of like his connection with the history, with the culture of Afghanistan as we imagine. And even if you look at the Taliban propaganda, Taliban and Pakistani supporters sort of posts in the Twitter or Facebook and everything else, there is not a single reference about, for instance, when the Taliban fight the Americans, there is not a single reference about, for instance, the Afghan history, about like how during the Anglo-Afghan wars, the Afghans were fighting against the British. They're completely using a very jihadist narrative that was common in South Asia and the Middle East and stuff. We don't see that things. There is a disconnect. To me, that's kind of a major difference in terms of it's kind of psychological, anthropological way of looking at how the group, in a way, shape their narrative. There's a much more international jihadist discourse within the Taliban. And while the Mujahideen had a complete reference all the time, most of the time they were referencing. And the other thing is, if you look at Afghan history in a sense, during the Mujahideen time, we never had a suicide attack. And actually, if you read the entire Afghan history until 1982, there was not a single Afghan national hero as a martyr, no martyr or shaheed, as we call it, ever sort of celebrated in the course of Afghan history. because it was kind of all the one was the country, the Ghazis, which is like the victorious living warrior, was celebrated in the course of Afghan history. Today, what we're seeing in the Taliban narrative, beside the suicide bomber, is absolute celebration of death, something very not based, rooted or related to the way that the Afghans in a way looked at their history and tried to define themselves. So these are sort of, from a psychological, social perspective, I see that differences in essence. And also there's some similarities, but the similarities comes when we look at the second tier, third tier of the Taliban, sort of fighters and commanders who are mostly local based, and there is a way that they can connect with it. And obviously it was mentioned when the Mujahideen took power in 1992, the intellectual community of Afghanistan was wiped out. Majority of them were assassinated in 1989, 88, 89 in Peshawar, or they left for the West. The same campaign that happened a few months ago in Kabul, an assassination of journalists, writers, thinkers, and stuff. But today, despite all of that, there is a sort of a community of the Afghans who actually can think, and more importantly, they can talk to the international community. That we didn't have in the 1992. We have to rely on others to trumpet.
May I have a quick intervention?
Yes, please, go on.
One of the biggest lessons, and perhaps in my opinion, the biggest lesson that can be drawn is that the war cannot be the answer. I think in the 90s, the Mujahideen side, they thought actually war could be the answer. And now, even though what we saw is that they could take over Kabul and the rest of the country, but what they ended up was not the Kabul as it was in the 90s, but it was actually a destroyed Kabul. And if that can be the biggest lesson, and these days, different parties are actually playing lip service to that and saying, yes, we do want a political settlement, but it's not clear if they were going to be ready to make the compromises necessary to make a political settlement. And number two, move forward on the political track before it's too late. One of the things that has been said about Dr. Najibullah's overtures, that the reason it failed is because maybe it was just too late for him. That it was not, because before it becomes too late and parties have made their own other plans, it's important to move forward. So if the war agenda can be taken off the table, then that would be the biggest lesson that can be learned, not only for Afghans, but for the regional countries as well. That's all I would say.
Thank you, Colin. I would like to get a couple questions in from the audience, if I could. There's one from Anna Syed. What is the role of indigenous collective action movements in this peace process, and how important is it to engage with them actively? And sort of a related question from Hila on what would be the actual mechanisms that one could envision for bringing about an inclusive peace process. So in the first instance, I'd like to pass those to Professor Cruz and then to Balkis.
Sure, thank you. A very challenging question, and I would defer to my Afghan colleagues, I must say, but thank you for directing that to me. I think, draw upon the resources of critical engagement that we see Afghan youth and intellectuals engaging in. I think the practice of street politics, of popular mobilization have been quite striking. The Hazara Enlightenment movement, the mostly Pashtun peace convoy. I mean, these demonstrations of public action, I think, are quite effective, and I think are not entirely new, but I think the scale is new, right? So we saw demonstrations in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Afghanistan, but I think the scale is different, and the extent of mobilization, partly aided by social media, I think are new. And these are, again, modeling peaceful collective action, peaceful demonstrations that I think are, to be sure, we find other moments of kind of violent, rioting, and that's another kind of broader challenge. But I think most of what we've seen over the last 20 years are, a series of very peaceful demonstrations, and it's often been the state that has introduced violence to such scenarios. So I think, in a way, I look at this, again, as a historian, looking at it broadly, I see a very productive way that, looking comparatively, other societies, including my own, have employed to try to seek change. So there, I think it's, again, I think a lot of when we talk about Afghan politics, we think about a kind of pathology, and we critique and we find shortcomings and we find areas to criticize. But here, I think this is a process that since 1960s has shown to be effective on a global scale, from Paris to Mexico City and beyond, that collective action, taking to the street, using public spaces as a kind of theater to express politics is quite productive and is an alternative to the kinds of violence that we've been critiquing today.
Okay,
yeah, I'll go next. So this is somehow related to the previous question. I think today Afghan youth, men and women at local level have initiated and continue to implement peace building efforts, vision building for the future of their country. And then all of that, women and girls play a critical role. This is a sign of grassroots up, I don't want to call it bottom up, but basically that's what I mean, efforts that are ongoing in order to build peace from the very grassroots level. And those efforts need to be kept authentic and also organic, and also be supported to take root. On the issue of mechanisms, I think now it's clear after almost 6 or 8 months of the start of negotiations in Doha, there is a need for a mediator. I think a mediator that both parties, Afghan government and Taliban, can agree on is necessary in order to move things forward. Agreeing on a ceasefire, it could be partial or a reduction of violence, whatever you want to call it, that's measurable, needs to take place so that people can have confidence in the process. Right now, Afghan people are left in an environment, in a situation that they're of anxiety, uncertainty. They don't know what will happen the next day. There are inconsistencies and contradictory statements by international partners that further adds to the level of anxiety and uncertainty in Afghanistan. So all that needs to be considered. The Taliban have to come to the table if they're genuinely committed to a peaceful resolution of conflict. You cannot hold negotiations with an empty table and chair. They have to be there in order to move the talks forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balkis.